Hello, you've tuned to this week's episode of Next Steps Forward, and I'm your host, Chris Meek. As always, it's an honor to have you with us. Next Steps Forward is committed to helping others achieve more than ever while experiencing greater personal empowerment and well-being. Our special guest today is Dr. Martin Dubin. Dr. Dubin is a clinical psychologist, serial entrepreneur, and business coach who has spent decades helping individuals and leaders better understand themselves and unlock their full potential. Among his accomplishments, Marty's founded several companies, including multimillion-dollar healthcare company, where he's also served as CEO. As a partner at talent firm RHR International, he worked directly with hundreds of C-suite senior executives from Fortune 500 companies and Silicon Valley venture capital firms and their portfolio companies. He is also the author of the acclaimed book, Blindspotting, How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader, which explores the hidden psychological blind spots that shape our decisions, relationships, and leadership. Dr. Marty Dubin, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thanks, Chris. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise, appreciate your time. I know how busy you are. And Marty, it's weird to say this, but let's begin at the beginning. And like I said, I admit that feels weird asking a clinical psychologist about his childhood. But studies suggest more than half of psychologists and almost 75% of counselors were drawn to their professions because they experienced family distress or early emotional experiences. What was your childhood like?
Yeah. I think my patients would appreciate you kind of turning the tables here. So, well, I guess I'm in the 50% that had a delightful childhood and no major kind of traumas. My father was a physician and probably no surprise of where, looking at my initials of my name, where I was probably directed right from early life. But I found psychology really later in life or in college. So it wasn't an early thing.
And what sparked your curiosity there?
Well, interestingly, so I was kind of science oriented throughout kind of school and signed up for all the pre-med courses in college. And it's one of those, we've all, I think, probably had these kind of events that we look back on that are just really important. And my roommate's older brother was a senior at the same school. And so I just showed him what I was taking. I don't even know what I was asking him for. Like, is this enough hours or something like that? And he asked me, he says, well, is that what you want to be taking? And I just looked and I thought, organic chemistry and all these other things. And it's like, I really don't. I mean, I'm okay with them, but I really don't. And I dropped them all. I kept a genetics course and then just started to dabble in all sorts of other things, history and philosophy and business, and then kind of found psychology. And I think I liked the helping profession. That certainly I grew up seeing my father doing that. And I realized that medicine was just, I don't know if I could have even articulated it then, but it was just always a narrowing kind of thing. Like you just get more and more expert in a smaller and smaller area. And my curiosity just that wasn't satisfying. And psychology had this kind of broad plate of what you could be interested in.
And some clinical psychologists see patients, and obviously others work exclusively in research without treating patients. And yet still others practice a combination of both. What camp do you fall into and why do you choose that direction?
Yeah, I didn't realize that. So I majored in psychology and then applied to graduate schools in psychology and got into one that I went to and found out what you just said, that it was very research oriented. And I wasn't really thinking of like, what's the career path? But I realized then the career path was being at a university doing research. And that wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I finished a master's there and then switched to a very clinical, patient-oriented practice kind of a program. And that's where I got my doctorate. And so I was definitely focused on seeing patients.
In your personal opinion, why do you feel that it's very research focused as opposed to helping people who really need the help?
Well, psychology in the 80s or maybe even the 70s split. They realized there was a conference and they kind of realized that the split that you just talked about, and they developed what they called the scientist practitioner model. And so some universities had PhD programs that were research oriented, and that was the career path, and others became what I went into, which was a doctorate of psychology, which we had to do a doctoral paper, but it was kind of a little bit on research, but much more on practice kind of focus. And so all the training was being in clinics and having practicums out in organizations. And so it was very focused on the need for practitioners, which was beginning to really become realized, I think, in society at that time, and certainly much more today.
Well, and that's a great segue. My next question, now that we're a handful of years post the COVID crisis, we know that there was a significant shortage of professionals like yourself in the heart of it. Are you seeing more of a transition into more, real world practicing folks like yourself out there now, and less on the research side, or is it still sort of a 50-50 split?
No, I don't think it's probably hasn't been a 50-50 split for quite a long time. The research programs tend to take, 5 to 10 people, and the practice programs take 40 to 50 people, because you can just deliver the teaching that way. And but we're still woefully inadequate in terms of meeting the need out there. I think at any one time, probably 20% of the population could use some help from a psychotherapist. And as you're probably well aware, there's profusion of other kind of disciplines, helping disciplines, kind of at a master's level, to try to really help with to meet the need that's out there.
And I know one of the, I'll call the roadblock that's hurt people like yourself in the profession from helping others is the state certifications. And during COVID, I know that the federal government sort of removed or put a temporary ban on that, where you could actually practice. Sorry, that's my dog Zeke. Say hello to Zeke. The UPS guy must be here. But you could practice across state lines. And do you think that that's something that could or should be done from a federal level to open it up more, as opposed to just kind of like practicing the bars as a lawyer, state specific?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to see that that happened, and it happened so quickly. I couldn't practice across state lines. And certainly there was a focus if you couldn't do therapy except with a patient in front of you in the office. And COVID really kind of pushed the boundaries about that, using video conferencing, which telemedicine had been around for a while. So I think there was already a bit of a opportunity for that. And it's just been wonderful from my point of view that has relaxed those requirements and allow people to do video therapy. And there are some things that clearly you can't pick up as well on a screen that you can see as the person is really in front of you, and you have to kind of figure out some ways to do that. But I think it's certainly necessary.
And when you began working with patients, what surprised you most about what people were struggling with and how they choose to deal with or not deal with their issues?
Well, psychology is an interesting mix. Well, most professions are of science and art. And I guess what became so clear to me was that the science of trying to assess what is the person's problem and what's contributing to that, and kind of understand their personality and their kind of pathology. That science part was not terribly difficult, quite frankly. I mean, it's not an exact science, but you can get pretty close. You're in the ballpark of what the person really is struggling with. But the art part is kind of what you're referencing, is how do you get people to really take advantage of the changes that they can make, and get past the resistance that they don't even realize they have, that are holding them back. And that was probably the more engaging and creative part of for me of psychotherapy is. And I really started to think about, what are the levers for this particular person? Is it kind of the emotion, trying to get in touch with their emotions, or is it an intellectual way, or is it just tell them, go behave differently, and let's talk about how that felt and what you thought afterwards. And so trying to figure out that art part of how to leverage people's ability to make change.
Yeah, and we know the one thing about people not seeking treatment is just, the general stigma associated with it.
Right.
I've done a lot of work in the first responder and the veteran space on that, and that's a bigger issue there, just given the security clearance and just, again, not getting a promotion, things like that. The one thing I've said has been a positive about COVID is that it put a big spotlight on mental health, and we've heard the phrase, it's okay to not be okay. And my question is, have you seen an influx of or an increase in the amount of patients, seeking help or treatment post-COVID, or has the number percentage still been about the same?
I've, as you kind of mentioned in the intro, my career kind of moved from psychotherapy and being involved in all that to business consulting. And so I'm actually not as in touch with kind of, probably any more than anybody else, just kind of what's happening in the general, what you pick up from the media. But stigma has always been there. It is definitely much less than it was certainly in the earlier parts of my career. And I hope that continues.
The next part's actually a very difficult thing to raise. It's very recent. I'm thinking about Martin Short's daughter, Catherine, and as I ask the next few questions, Catherine was a social worker committed to reducing the stigma of mental illness. And as we know, sadly, she took her own life last week. What is the most difficult part of being a psychologist or a counselor? And does a psychologist or counselor give up a part of themselves when they choose to help others?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that is something that I don't think they taught me in graduate school, but it's something that you really learn. And it, quite frankly, led me to have some changes in my career. When you're full-time private practice, you're opening your door about every 45, 50 minutes, ushering one person out and another person in all day long. And, there's a balance of being open and empathic and very present with somebody and being able to feel and understand what they're feeling, but not feel it at such a deep level that it really affects your own feelings, and yet not become hardened to all of that. And I think all psychotherapists, find the kind of right gear to be able to do that. But there are times when there's just things going on in your own life, or somebody's story is particularly compelling, that becomes even more difficult to do that. When I would get home, my wife would ask me, "How was your day?" And quite frankly, the last thing I wanted to talk about was all of that. I think I learned to compartmentalize it, a little on the way home, just through traffic and everything else, just turn on the radio and put it all behind me, and not wanting to think about it again until kind of back in the chair in the office the next day.
Well, maybe as a follow-up to that, how did you take care of your own well-being? Who's the therapist, if you will? Because some things had to resonate with you. Maybe it was just an awful situation or a story. Maybe it was something that you could relate to because you or a family member or a friend went through something similar. And my wife would be the first to tell you, I'm an only child from divorced parents. And so I've got, my own baggage and my own luggage. And I compartmentalize things very well, maybe too well. But at some point that just wears on you to an extent where you can't do that anymore. And so as a professional, how can you do that and just keep moving forward? So it doesn't just eat away at you on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think almost all psychotherapists have either kind of consultation groups where they're talking about that with others, or their own particular supervisor or mentor, somebody that they have for that. And I definitely did that at various points in my life. And you also begin to realize what people you can't treat or you shouldn't treat. Sometimes it's that they just push buttons that you can't get empathic with them. So know, to be able to screen that out and refer those people to other people. And I think most every psychotherapist practice begins to kind of coalesce around a certain particular bandwidth of types of people that you feel like you work well with and you can help.
For most people, one career is more than enough, and especially in a field that requires as much study and discipline as psychology. When did you decide you wanted to be an entrepreneur? And was that always a goal of yours, or did something call you to become an entrepreneur?
It was not self-directed. I was, as I kind of said, I found myself when I just didn't like being in the office all day long. And I found myself finding reasons to get out, consult or do other things. And there was a part of me that just felt kind of like life was passing me by to some extent, as engaging as the work was. And healthcare was beginning to change, healthcare becoming managed and trying to figure out how to manage all that. And I became really curious about that, about the business side and of of mental health care. And so a colleague, a psychiatrist, a friend of mine, and another psychologist, we established a managed behavioral health company. So insurance companies were looking for companies to manage the mental health. It's different, obviously, than the rest of healthcare in a lot of ways. And so the insurance companies were comfortable managing surgery, OBGYN, cardiology, whatever it might be. And they were looking for companies like ours. And so we saw an opportunity. And I was just very curious about kind of the broader epidemiological questions, like how many schizophrenics are going to come in over the year into the office, and how many depressed people, and what are the different kinds of treatments available in hospital and outpatient and all of that. And so that was our job, was to try to manage and predict the cost of the care and the quality of the care and the access for the care.
So you went from organic chemistry as an undergrad to financial accounting and statistics in the real world.
Yeah, I had a computer on my desk, a printer, printing out checks, to pay hospitals and doctors. It was like, what am I doing here? I have no idea.
A little different than organic chemistry. So obviously there are entrepreneurs, and then there are entrepreneurs. You fall into that second category after co-founding the company Pro Behavioral Health. As CEO, you grew the company to 250 employees and $50 million in revenue. What problem, opportunity, or both did you see that led you to create Pro Behavioral Health? And what was your vision for it at the very beginning?
Yeah, at the beginning, so we saw all these changes that were going on in healthcare and thought, well, oh my God, there's insurance executives trying to make these decisions on what's quality care and how long should somebody be in the hospital or in outpatient care. And I thought, and my colleagues thought, well, hell, we can do that way better than them. I mean, and there was certainly quite a bit of hubris. We didn't have the actuarial accounting financial skill set, but we definitely had the core skill set of what really are the problems and what's the way to begin to kind of manage the healthcare in a much more organized, thoughtful way. And so that was the vision. The vision really wasn't anything beyond that. And I started to kind of dial back my private practice and dial up the business part until the business became big enough that it was I had to close my private practice. And we got quite successful we did that for about 15 years, and maybe 10 years in or so, we were attracting the private equity people coming in, wanting to give us money to grow even bigger. And I remember, to your point, one of them asking, well, what's your exit strategy? And I didn't even know what that term meant. My eyes went to the exit sign for the door. Like, no, he's not asking about that. But so it really there was no other than we like doing it, and I'll just keep doing it as long as I can.
That's the famous private equity question: is what's your exit strategy?
Right.
And that means they're here with a checkbook, and they're your exit. Many people, and I'm definitely one of them, believe America's mental health care system is broken, to say the least. What do people misunderstand about how mental health care is delivered in this country? What do they understand all too well? And how can we create a system where people receive the mental health care they need when they need it?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody really understands it well. And I mean, it's so complex, and there's so many factors. And there's, on the one hand, a budgetary, from a healthcare standpoint, you can only spend a certain amount of money. Our job in our company was really, we needed to advocate for a bigger slice of the pie from the insurance company for mental health and take it away from, orthopedics or somewhere else. And who knows what the right slices of the pies are for all of that. And you look at what the prevalence is in the population, you look at what the cost of care is, and the people that are seeking care, and try to come to some reasonable conclusions about that. And certainly when I started, there was probably too many psychiatric hospital beds, quite frankly, and people were in the hospital for long periods of times, adolescents for sometimes 6 months or a year. And now there's just not enough by any stretch of the imagination. Hospitals, can make more from that room with all the equipment and everything else than they can just a bed and a person sitting there talking to somebody. So it's a huge problem to try to figure out what's the right adequate amount of funding for all of that. the ability to get people in for emergency care. I've certainly seen where treating serious psychiatric problems quickly and rapidly when they first appear, you can shorten the length of time. When people delay coming in for huge, years, then it's just you've got problem mounted upon problem to try to kind of sort through. It's it's in a conundrum.
And did you set out to build a company of the size and scale of Pro Behavioral Health, or just grow beyond what you initially imagined?
Yeah, I don't think we imagined anything other than let's just keep growing, and we felt like we were successful, and so we got more and more opportunities. An insurance company we'd be responsible for a particular state, and they'd say, "You're doing great. Could you come over here and on this state and take over our plan there?" And so we grew across the country and managed healthcare, and then it became insurance companies were merging with each other and acquiring each other, because scale is really important in trying to manage healthcare. And so we saw, and then we and other companies like ours had really kind of pushed the limits of how far we could kind of manage all that, and it became much more cookbook and clear about what to do. And so we saw that it was time to sell at that point, and the insurance companies wanted to bring it in house and not vendor it out to somebody else. So we sold to Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield, which was the first one or two largest insurance company, health insurer in the country.
Building a company in the healthcare space is obviously incredibly complex. What were the biggest obstacles you faced early on?
Well, we didn't know what we didn't know. And I think because it was so new, the error, we could make errors and it wasn't an existential issue. But as we got bigger, it became more of a real, small mistakes can have huge impacts as you get larger and larger. And so I think early on we really were kind of wild west and just figuring it out as we went along. And it's like, oh, I got to learn about this, and that's fun. We'll figure out how to do these kind of fancy actuarial predictions, and we did that. That carried us for, we can talk about problems because they did come up, but they carried us for a while.
And did your training as a psychologist give you an advantage as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Business is about relationships, right? And so, there just maybe one simple concept. There's a concept in psychotherapy about transference, where the patient transfers onto you important people in their life, and so they behave to the therapist as if they're their father or their mother or whatever. And we all do that in all relationships. And my colleagues and it just struck us. Well, it's like, wait a minute. It became obvious when we were doing business development, certain business people related to me or to one of my partners better or someone else. And we really thought about that and why was that? And so I think we were really playing with the, how to build strong relationships, which we knew how to do as psychotherapists, to really as a foundation. So that was quite helpful. Can I take a 5-second break? I need to just run to the restroom.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Pause right here.
Okay.
All right. We've got about 4 minutes before the break. So, Marty, even as successful as you were, founding and leading Pro Behavior Health must have taught you some lessons. What lessons did you learn about resilience in leadership or in other areas?
Yeah. So looking back from the point of view of the leadership work that I've been doing, I realized a number of times of when I was not an effective leader and didn't certainly know it at the time. And just one maybe real clear example is we got into a contract problem with one of our large insurance companies. The way our business worked is they would give us historical data, and then we would predict about how much it would cost to manage all that healthcare. And we realized that they had given us bad data. And so we were losing money month after month after month. It just was unsustainable for us. And I realized that, and I was CEO, and I thought, well, I'll just talk to them about it and we'll fix it. And that's not the way things work, right? I mean, we had a rate, and they said, fine, I'm sorry about that, but we'll talk next year when your rate comes up to. And my colleague, my partner, said, no, we've got to sue them. And I thought, oh my God, you got to be kidding me. No, this is one of our larger customers. How are we going to do that? And I realized, and there's been stuff written on this, there are times to be a peacetime CEO and there are times to be a wartime CEO. And my natural instinct was to be a peacetime. That's kind of who I am in terms of my personality traits. And really, that was just a lesson that, I learned it the hard way, as most lessons we learn, and it stuck with me. I mean, I really evaluate situations now of, do I need to behave differently than is my normal way of behaving, and be more aggressive than I am typically.
We've been talking to Dr. Martin Dubin. Alice has been setting us up to talk about his book, Blindspotting: How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader. We'll be right back after a short break, so please stay with us. And we are back. I'm Chris Meek, host of Next Steps Forward, and our special guest today is Dr. Marty Dubin. Dr. Dubin is a clinical psychologist, serial entrepreneur, and business coach who has spent decades helping individuals and leaders better understand themselves and unlock their full potential. Among his accomplishments, Dr. Dubin founded several companies, including a multimillion-dollar healthcare company. He has worked with hundreds of C-suite senior executives from Fortune 500 companies and Silicon Valley venture capital firms and their portfolio companies. And he's the author of Blindspotting: How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader. Marty, let's talk about your book, Blindspotting, which examines the psychological blind spots that shape our thoughts, behaviors, and relationships without our awareness. At what point did you begin to recognize just how powerful our psychological blind spots can be?
Yeah, I didn't set out to write a book. Actually, January before COVID, I pulled back from the work that I was doing, and then COVID hit, and I was sitting on the couch like everybody else, and I just started thinking I've had a really unusual career as a psychologist, and kind of what do I know and what still don't I know? What have I learned? What am I curious about? And just started writing, and then after I was really writing for myself, and then after a while, I thought, oh my God, this is a book. And so then what came to me is my entire career, the thread that goes through all of it has been around self-awareness. That's really, in all the work I did, I tried to help people become more self-aware. And so that led to the concept of blind spots. Those are the things that we aren't aware of. It's just, it's not a judgment. It's just kind of part of the way our system works. We have biases, and we pay attention to certain things and not other things. And so I worked with many successful CEOs, but yet, they were tripping up at times. And so the concept of blind spots, were trying to help them see when they kind of we're behaving in ways that we're not as effective, like my example of peacetime and wartime CEO.
Do you have CEOs reach out to you saying, "Hey, Marty, I need some help,"
Yeah.
or do you see people like, "Hey, I think you missed something here," and do you reach out to them proactively? Combination?
Yeah, it's probably a combination. More often than not, it's people that say, "I want to be better." Coaching is like athletics in business. I mean, the elite athletes get more coaching, and the elite CEOs that really know that they can be better want more and more feedback and more coaching. But I've certainly been brought in by HR departments and by boards of directors of say, can you help, this senior leader, the CEO, because they're struggling.
It's interesting what you just said, how you mentioned that senior leaders who are, the Michael Jordans, if you will, of their peers, they want to get better and they're looking for more coaching. And I think, I'm in the finance world, and Jamie Dimon has been the darling, really post financial crisis, almost 20 years ago now. And you look at somebody like that, it's like, can he actually have more coaching? But to your point, you can always get better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and don't elite athletes have multiple coaches, for all different, and their behaviors examined, you've got videotapes and all sorts of things. And I think, there are some executives that, are that open, like, please give me feedback all the time. And they're creating cultures of feedback within their company. And that's a part of, sometimes they bring me in to help with that. Let's create a culture where everybody's giving feedback. We all want to be better. It's a team, it's a team sport in business.
And what exactly is a psychological blind spot? And do we all have them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's bugs in the system. It's biases. There's, that in finance, there's a huge area of research in financial behavioral economics about where people make really silly financial decisions, and it's driven by emotion and things that are not in their best interests. And that's true in all parts of our lives. We're not a rational, dispassionate observer of and collector of data. I mean, there's so much data out there all the time. We have to screen and filter about what we pay attention to. And so in doing that, you're already creating a blind spot, right? You're just ignoring certain aspects because, you have a pattern recognition in the past that tells you that this is the way to go. And that probably works 80 or 90% of the time. But there are those times when just the way our brain works, we're not aware of certain things.
And it's always that 10 or 20% that hurt the most.
Yeah, exactly. And our greatest opportunities for learning.
How do blind spots develop? Do they tend to originate from early life experiences and harden as we grow up, or can they sort of just pop up at any time?
I think I don't think they just pop up. I think they are well established. It's even if you look at what's fascinating things that have been about AI and distributed neural networks, we're looking at, there is a model there of how the brain works. Certain patterns get strengthened. And that's how AI, figures things out. It gets trained and strengthened here, recognize these things, and our brains do that same kind of thing. And so in doing that, we are, as I just kind of said, we're kind of develop patterns of the way we respond. And if we sat there and thought all the time, is this the right thing to do? And you examine you'd get nothing done. So most things are just automatic, and only on reflection or only on realizing that you got a bad result, or somebody telling you, you were tone deaf in the room, didn't you notice that? That's when we begin to see, gosh, our pattern recognition in that particular situation was really off. And so I think it's just the way our brain works. It's not a judgment, but it is these kind of developed patterns that create it.
Are blind spots more emotional, cognitive, or behavioral, or some combination of all three?
Yeah. So when I wrote the book, I was trying to answer that kind of question, and I came up with 6 areas. Those are 3 of them, the way you just mentioned just now, actually. But I came up with 6 areas of where blind spots occur. And we're an integrated system, so they all overlap and work off of each other. But it's helpful, I think, to at least begin to get a handle on them, to think about them in these 6 discrete areas. So, I talk about identity, our traits, and our intellect, and in addition to kind of behavior and emotions that that you'd already mentioned.
And what are some of the most common blind spots people have? And if there's one blind spot you wish people would recognize in themselves, what would it be?
Maybe the easiest one to get a hold of is our trait blind spots. And these are, so our traits are the adjectives we use to describe ourselves or other people use to describe us. That hardworking or conscientious or bold or, aggressive. And those are things that we often are our strengths and that have gotten us where we've gone. And one way to begin to get a sense of, I noticed when I was working with executives and collecting feedback about them that each of those strengths had a flip side to them. And sometimes that's what people were talking about when they would complain about that executive or give me advice, want me to give them advice about what they should change. And so one way to maybe quickly for your listeners and to get a hold of that is I tell people, think about what are those couple of those strengths that you really kind of admire about yourself, people admire about you, that you rely on. And then put the modifier TOO in front of it. What happens when you're too curious? What happens when you're too organized? What happens when you're too confident? And those are probably things that your spouse or friends tell you about at times. And those are windows into when your strengths are tipping over and becoming problems.
That's a fascinating way to turn that around. We're just putting those 3 simple letters in front of that. So now you've got me thinking I'm afraid to ask my wife or my kids.
They've already told you.
That's true. That's the sad part. So Marty, is it fair to say that many of us are living out patterns we didn't consciously choose or maybe don't even recognize?
Yes. One blind spot area I talk about is the identity blind spots. And we're often aware of a lot of our identities. Some of them, we take on at birth, gender identity, position in the, sibling position in a family, all sorts of things, culture, language, a lot of that. And some identities we take on, as we grow and develop, maybe you become a foodie or a runner or a Buddhist, and maybe then you aren't anymore. So we can kind of, at some point you weren't a parent and then you became a parent. That's an important identity. And sometimes those identities lurk in the background and we're not quite aware of them, and that they can kind of interrupt our success. I had one I talk about in the book, one client who got passed over for a promotion, and she was a number 2 and wanted to get to the president level. And as she described herself to me, she says, I'm the invisible glue. I solve all the problems before they really show up. I make my boss's job much easier. And so I'm thinking, like, you got passed over and your identity is to be invisible. Do we have an answer right there? And so it was an eye opener for her about how she didn't want to be invisible anymore. She really did want to be out there, and she really could. And so the coaching really was on how to change her own personal brand in such a way that it would allow for the career advancement that she wanted.
Let's talk about that for a second. Is a little sidebar with the personal brand. Is that something you see a lot in some of these executives you're coaching in terms of them building their personal brand a blind spot, or is that something that they didn't think about or that they want to do more of?
I think when I ask people, what's your brand at work, I usually get a stare. So most people, I think, don't think about that. And then I say, go ask people, and it's sometimes it's things that they kind of knew about themselves, and sometimes it isn't. And it's a real eye opener. Responsibility is both a trait and it can become an identity. And I've certainly seen that in CEOs where they are being just overly responsible. They don't delegate. They think every decision rests on their shoulders. And so their communication at times gets constrained. And so helping them realize that responsibility, which really is a wonderful characteristic and probably got them up to the top, also has this kind of downside, that if they don't kind of watch it, it's going to, it interferes with their effectiveness.
Are blind spots primarily a form of self-protection, or are they better described as a limitation in our ability to see ourselves clearly?
It's an interesting question. So, having been a psychotherapist, and, the comment about protection is how often we looked at people, that they have defense mechanisms, ways to kind of shield them from insults that are coming from the outside world that they feel like they can't handle. So, but I didn't want to look at things that way in terms of, I'm dealing with healthy personalities. I'm dealing with people who want to get better. You certainly could interpret their blind spots. I think for some people, in some ways, they're in that kind of defensive posture. But I don't find that helpful, because then it gets into kind of judgments and people feeling like they're being critiqued. And so I think the concept of blind spot is just, it's everybody has one. I mean, has multiple ones. We all kind of know that. You can just kind of point it out all the time, and we're all kind of aware of it. So I think it helps to kind of neutralize that sense of being judged or being and overly judging yourself. And so being able to be kind of open, hey, yeah, that's right. What can I do to fix that?
And how do blind spots quietly, or maybe not so quietly in some cases, shape our decisions, relationships, and even our sense of identity?
Yeah. So we do have a lot to pay attention to as leaders, and you become overwhelmed. And so you really do develop these habit patterns of being able to filter things in and out. And so that's, I think, how blind spots kind of continue to develop over time. And even, I don't know, I think when I die, I'm going to die with my blind spots. I mean, we don't really cure them or get rid of them. It's back to this concept of self-awareness. The model I have in the book is a self-awareness model. And really, it's very much, I think, as I said earlier, kind of like athletics. It's just constantly trying to get better, constantly being aware of, if you're playing basketball and your eyes are looking to the left, signaling where you're going to move, you need to learn not to do that. You need to, do something else with your eyes, and constantly work on that. And so those are the kinds of things with blind spots. It's just being aware of those small little tweaks. These aren't major changes in somebody's personality. I think that can also become a hindrance to people seeking coaching or getting feedback, as they think, oh, they've got to change who they are and their personality. And my approach and my thought is that small tweaks can have huge impact. You have to have a discipline about making those changes, but then they can, make that extra 5-10% improvement in your performance.
And again, maybe as a follow-up to that, are people afraid to change some of their blind spots because they think it's going to be a huge Herculean lift and not realize that they are just those, to your point, those small tweaks?
Yeah, I absolutely. And, I have a chapter in the book that's, built on all these kind of habit pattern changes that we, it's like, you want to get healthier and you decide you need to go to the gym, you need to kind of do that in a disciplined way, or change your diet and so on. It's nothing, it's work and it's discipline and it's focus, and it does take a piece of your brain to pay attention, but it isn't Herculean lift. And a lot of leaders, I tell them, you have so much going on. I only want about 2% of your brain, and maybe on Fridays about 5 or 10% for you to review the week. And that's what this is about. This, you shouldn't have to be thinking about this continually, and it isn't a huge lift.
So there's no Ozempic pill you can take to cure all and pop it once a day?
No, I had, I had one leader tell me about one of his partners. He said, who was just always saying the wrong thing. He said, isn't there just a kind of empathy button you could put on his phone that you could push that? And that was like 10 years ago or so. And my God, we've got that now with ChatGPT, right? Say this instead of that. So we maybe we'll get to that Ozempic.
We'll get there. I'm sure we will. How often do blind spots prevent people from achieving their goals or becoming the person they want to be?
So maybe a good example, I had one leader who she was wanted to move up to senior leadership, and her personality and her brand was speak truth to power. And she was always the one to, in a reasonable way, but kind of push back against senior management when they had some particular proposal. And we were talking, and she wanted to become management. And I said, well, what are we going to be able to do here? And I think that you're going to have to change who you are to some extent and to be able to kind of manage that. And so she really struggled with how to still hold on to that sense of who she was, but be able to morph it in such a way that it would fit with upper leadership. And she was able to. She kind of became the senior leadership explainer of, here's why we're doing it. And she had credibility with the staff and be able to do that. And she learned when to kind of not to fight every hill and know when to kind of do that. And so there are changes sometimes we have to make to our personality to modify them to kind of meet our career goals.
One of the most fascinating ideas in Blindspotting is that our greatest strengths can also create our greatest blind spots. And that's something I've long believed. How can the very qualities that help us succeed also quietly undermine us?
Yeah, I think they happen lots of ways. I mean, I remember when I was doing a lot of work in Silicon Valley, and I would be working with these engineers who were very, analytical and rational, and they would just get so upset about people who were emotional, and why didn't they agree with? I laid out, my argument. It was perfect, and I said, well, you know what, emotions are data, just like all this other stuff, and you're feeling emotional now, you're upset, and so how smart is it of you to kind of ignore an entire data set and not pay attention to that? And how can you bring that data set in and begin to use it and think about it in a way? So there are ways to kind of take your strengths and maybe pivot them a little bit and be able to still use them in a way. And again, this is back to kind of just greater self-awareness.
And maybe as a follow-up to that, how can we begin to identify our own blind spots? And especially if by definition, we can't see them, and how can someone recognize when their super strength is no longer serving them and is actually holding them back?
Yeah, so I gave that one example of kind of using that modifier of 2, but the other is really through feedback from others. I mean, that was one of the most powerful things I do as an executive coach is interview all the leaders that work with that leader and then put that in, organize the feedback and present it, and having leaders say, well, that wasn't my intent, I wasn't trying to, do whatever, that person felt, but that was the impact. That's how they felt. And so creating a feedback culture and being open for feedback, and sometimes asking people, hey, I'm going to work on X, in the next 2 meetings, will you watch and see if I talk too much, and I'm going to not try to talk as much. I make more declarative statements. I'm going to try to ask more questions. Will you watch and maybe count and let me know how I did? So those are the kinds of things I think we can all do to kind of begin to open ourselves up. It really has to come from feedback, because it is a catch-22. If it is your blind spot, you can't really see it.
What role does ego play, if any, in maintaining our blind spots?
Our ego?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that is back to kind of our personal brand, that we feel like who we are and our identity. It does take a sense of being a little more generous with yourself. Sometimes people are just overly critical. Sometimes people get into kind of imposter syndrome, where they're always questioning everything they do. The people that are overly on the ego, I think, are the opposite of that. And I think a little bit of imposter syndrome is probably good for all of us if we're moving up and changing. It's like, can I really do this? And, what really are the challenges ahead for me now? And so I certainly try in the book and try in my own practice is to kind of tell people just to be generous with yourself. And, we're all imperfect and we're all just trying to be better.
The word I've been trying to use post-COVID is grace.
Yeah, it's great.
Give yourself a little grace. Did writing the book cause you to confront any of your own blind spots, or did you have all that pretty much figured out by this time?
Well, it made me become aware of some. I mentioned the one about that kind of peacetime and wartime CEO. And so, one of my traits is agreeableness. There's a theory of the big five theory of personality. There are five traits that have shown to be consistent over time. They're only part of who we are, but the agreeableness was one for me that I realized I have to kind of watch. I also became aware, it was just interesting in that I thought later, why did we have that problem with that company where we were losing money? Why did we, even though they gave us bad data, I thought, well, that was their problem. We just need to fix it. But I thought afterwards, like, well, I was a CEO. Why did I sign the contract? Why did we not pick up on the bad data? And I realized that my identity at that time was as a psychologist with a business. We were successful, we'd done well. But if my identity would have been, I'm a business person who just happens to have psychological knowledge, I probably would have had a much stronger data department and accounting, and I would have been really eagle eye on all of that, and I really wasn't. And so maybe I'm in my fourth career right now as an author, and it's making me think about my identity. What is my identity now? What do I really want it to be? And how aligned am I with who I am with my identity? There's one thing in the book that has gotten the most, I think, response. It's a part in the behavior chapter on prioritization where I talk about what only the CEO can do. And it's a outgrowth of an article written by the CEO of Procter & Gamble in, I think, 2009, where he kind of asked that question. And I've come up with 5 things that only the CEO can do. And if they're not doing those 5 things, then somebody else is doing them, or they're not getting done. And there's lots of things you can do, and everybody's asking you to do things as a CEO and pay attention to this and talk to this person. But if you don't have a clear filter on your identity and your role, and what is that role and how does it fit with my identity? So that has been a really, I've taken that away from writing the book and really been thinking a lot about that. And I think I've been helping a lot of others about thinking very clearly about what are the demands of your role. No matter who you are, you have a role that only you can do that, in that role, and think about how that aligns with your identity and what shifts you may need to make.
I can't believe we're at the end of our conversation, but before we go, please tell our audience how they can find your book and get in touch with you if they'd like to see you in person.
Great, thank you. Well, the book's for sale wherever you buy your books. It's published by Harvard Business Review Press, but you can find it on Amazon or anywhere. And I've got 2, you can reach, I have an author website, martindubin.com, but probably the best place is blindspotting.com. I've, with some colleagues, created a website where we have a lot of material from the book and others, these podcasts, other kind of material. We also have a test, Blindspotting test, where I wanted to create a test that was really kind of surgical, looking specifically at your blind spots and where you might be at risk. And so you can find that on the website as well.
Dr. Martin Dubin, clinical psychologist, serial entrepreneur, business coach, and author of Blindspotting: How to See What's Holding You Back as a Leader. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Chris. Really enjoyed the conversation.
No, it was a lot of fun. Really appreciate the insight. I'm Chris Meek. We're out of time. We'll see you next week, same time, same place. And until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.